Along with metaphors, one of the hardest things to translate are figures of speech. So often a figure of speech cannot come into the target language. But in 1 Corinthians 13:5, I think we have an example of a figure of speech that can and in fact should come into English. In Paul's famous love chapter, he's talking about what love is and what love isn't. And it says, it is not rude, it does not seek the things of itself, it is not easily angered. And then here's our expression, not it is reckoned the evil. So the figure of speech is logizetai. And if you'll notice, what it means is determined by mathematical process. And it's often translated something like reckon or calculate. Now, it can be used without that mathematical nuance. It could simply mean to give careful attention to a matter, to think about, to consider, to ponder, to let one's mind dwell on. But I don't think that really fits the context as much over in 1 Corinthians 13, is that it is not counting up. It is not reckoning bad things. In other words, it doesn't keep track of bad things. My wife has a very short, long-term memory that when I've done things that are offensive to her, we talk about it, and then she forgets it. She just simply doesn't remember those things. That's her decision, and frankly, I'm very thankful for that. But it's interesting to look at the history of the translation of verse 5 and see people struggle with that figure of speech. Over here in the King James, it says, it thinketh no evil. So that's the second definition in BDAG. It doesn't think about evil things. Then you look at the NASB, which really does keep the King James language as much as it can. It says, it does not take into account a wrong suffered. And suffered is the verb they're adding. Does not take into account. See, it's keeping the figure of speech, and that's helpful. However, in the RSV, that's reflected here in the ESV, they got rid of the figure of speech and they simply said resentful. And there's a footnote in the ESV. It says the Greek means irritable and does not count up wrongdoing. Well, either way you go, you've lost the metaphor, I think. It's interesting that in the NRSV, it stays resentful. Perhaps more surprisingly, in the Net Bible, it goes resentful. But the CSB says, no, let's get back to the figure of speech. Doesn't keep a record of wrongs. And you see the same thing in the NLT. Keeps no record of being wronged. So the NIV's translation, it keeps no record of wrongs, is actually a very, very good translation. It's what the Greek says, and it's what the Greek means. So I'm going to go with the NIV and the CSB on this one for sure, as you can see in my translation. One of the more interesting things that happened on the ESV is that when we finished 1 Corinthians 13, we worked really hard on it because it was really important that we keep the poetry of it. And when we are done with 13, someone said, and to this day I don't know who it was, someone said almost under his breath, I wonder if 1 Corinthians 13 is really poetry. That really stuck with me. I don't think it is poetry. I think Paul is really frustrated with the Corinthian church in the exercise of their spiritual gifts. The one thing they're obviously not doing is acting out of love. And in very powerful rhetorical language, not poetic, but rhetorical language, he says, no, this is not what gifts are for. This is not how you work gifts out in the real world, because love isn't rude. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. Come on, y'all. It doesn't keep account of wrongs. So I think Paul is more frustrated than anything else with the Corinthian church. And again, in rhetorically powerful ways, wants to drive the point home of what love is and what love isn't. Now, my apologies to all of you that had 1 Corinthians 13 read at your wedding. But this is not a love chapter, and it's not a sandwich chapter. It is part of 12 and 14, and is part of Paul's answer to the excesses of the charismatic movement in the Corinthian church. But the main point I wanted to make is that figures of speech can be difficult to bring into translation, but when they can, I think they should be.